July 11, 1960. The Sands Hotel, Las Vegas. The air isn't just thick. It's a broth simmered from cigarette smoke, ambition, spilled bourbon, and fear. On a stage brighter than 1,000 suns, a man is fighting for his soul with every step, every note. Sammy Davis, Jr., isn't just performing, he's conjuring magic to keep the wolves at bay. In the royal box, Frank Sinatra watches with the focused intensity of a general surveying his troops. And gliding through the shadows of the packed Copa room, a glass in hand like a casual scepter, is Dean Martin. His smile is easy, but his eyes are everywhere. And in the deepest, plushest booth, shrouded in a halo of cigar smoke, sits the real power, a mafia boss. He isn't tapping his foot to the rhythm. He's studying Sammy like a predator calculating the angle of a pounce. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. It will become an execution. A brutal, calculated humiliation designed to shatter the brightest star in the sky and remind every other entertainer in this desert kingdom who truly holds the leash. But in this high-stakes game of nerve and reputation, the mob boss made one fatal miscalculation. He didn't account for the quiet man, the one they all underestimated. The one who would look at his friend's impending destruction and with a voice soft as velvet and cold as steel, would utter the three most dangerous words in the underworld. Enough, back off. This is the untold story of the night the mob tried to break Sammy Davis, Jr., and the shocking, graceful fury with which Dean Martin shut it all down. To understand the earthquake of that night, you have to map the fault lines of the era. The neon glow of the Vegas Strip in 1960 was a mirage of freedom, a playground built on a foundation of hidden violence. The mob didn't just influence Las Vegas, they were its architects, its silent partners, its grim reapers. The casinos were cash registers for the underworld, and the entertainers were the dazzling magnets that drew the money in. A sold-out show meant packed gambling floors. It meant legitimacy, it meant power, and the kings of this magnetic field were the Rat Pack. Sinatra, the charismatic, volatile chairman of the board, Dean Martin, the seemingly effortless, perpetually amused crooner, and Sammy Davis, Jr., the human dynamo whose talent was so blinding it threatened to eclipse the very system that showcased it. But Sammy's position was uniquely precarious. He was a black man in a world ruled by white, often deeply prejudiced, gangsters. He could perform on the grandest stage, but he couldn't stay in the hotel as a guest. He could make the owners millions, but he had to enter through the service entrance. His talent was his passport, but it was stamped with a conditional visa, forever subject to revocation by men in silk suits who saw him as property, not a person. Sammy's salvation, his fortress, was his bond with Frank and Dean. With Frank, it was a fierce tribal loyalty. Frank saw injustice and sought to bulldoze it. He was a shield, loud and proud. But with Dean, Dean was a mystery. He moved through the chaos of their lives with a detached, amused air, a highball in one hand, a cigarette in the other, a joke perpetually on his lips. People saw the act, the lovable drunk, the carefree king of cool. They missed the quiet, observant intelligence behind those heavy-lidded blue eyes. Dean watched. He saw the microaggressions, the condescending tones from network executives, the way a maitre d' might subtly steer Sammy to a different table. Dean never made a scene. He'd simply materialize, his presence alone altering the chemistry of the space. A well-placed, deceptively gentle barb, delivered with that disarming smile, would deflate the bigot without them even realizing they'd been gutted. It was a language of protection spoken in a whisper, a subtle art of deflection that Sammy understood deeply. He knew Dean's nonchalance was a weapon carefully sheathed. But there were forces in their world that could not be deflected with a joke. The real power resided in men whose names were whispered. Sam Giancana *** of Chicago, who considered Frank his personal jukebox. Moe Dalitz ***, the Cleveland transplant who helped build the Vegas desert into an empire of sin. Johnny Rosselli ***, the Hollywood fixer. These men viewed the Rat Pack as their crown jewels, flashy, valuable, but ultimately possessions. They demanded a respect that was, in reality, abject obedience. A summons to a private party in a mob-owned casino's back room was not an invitation, it was a command performance. The atmosphere at these gatherings was a chilling paradox, boisterous laughter overlaying a current of pure menace. A joke from the boss had to be met with uproarious laughter. A request, no matter how demeaning, was a test of loyalty. To fail was to risk everything, your career, your comfort. Some whispered your life. This was the invisible cage within which these glorious birds sang. And then Sammy flew too close to the sun. His romance with and impending marriage to the beautiful Swedish actress May-Britt Asterisk. It was a genuine love, but in the eyes of 1960s America, and more importantly, in the eyes of the deeply traditional, often viciously racist mob hierarchy, it was a scandal of atomic proportions. Hate mail avalanched the studios. Death threats were called into the Sands switchboard. Newspaper columnists moralized. Mob bosses saw this as more than a personal affair. They saw it as a threat to business. It drew the wrong kind of attention. FBI agents, who were constantly sniffing around the edges of their casino operations, might use the controversy as a wedge. To the old-world dons, Sammy was a talented servant who had forgotten his place. The order came down, not in a memo, but in a series of cold stares and ominous silences. He needs to be reminded. Humble him. Put him back in his box. The stage for the reminder was set at a party at the Asterisk Flamingo Hotel ***, in a private dining room known as the Vault. The guest list was a who's who of connected men and a few terrified showgirls. The Rat Pack had been invited. Frank knew it was a setup. He paced in Dean's suite at the Sands, his anger a tangible force. They're gonna make him jump Dino. They're gonna try to make him a clown for those greaseballs. Dean sat on the couch, meticulously stirring a drink, the ice cubes clinking like tiny warning bells. He didn't look at Frank. He stared out at the blinking marquee of the dunes across the street. So we go, Dean said, his voice flat. We smile, we drink their booze. Frank spun on him, and when they ask him to do some degrading bit, when they try to make him, Dean finally looked at Frank. The casualness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a calm, oceanic depth. We'll see, he said softly. We'll see what they ask. It wasn't a plan, it was a readiness. The Vault lived up to its name. It felt sealed off from the world. Soundproofed by money and menace. Plush red carpets, dark wood, the sweet, acrid scent of Cuban cigars. At the head table sat the presiding royalty. Let's call him Salvatore Sal Vittorio ***, a Chicago envoy with a reputation for psychological cruelty. He had a face that seemed permanently set in a disdainful half-smile. His hands, adorned with heavy gold rings, rested on the table like dormant weapons. Sammy entered, flanked by Frank and Dean. He was the picture of cool, sharp tuxedo, gleaming smile, but those who knew him could see the slight tightness around his eyes, the hyper-awareness in his stance. The greetings were performed, the air kisses, the bone-crushing handshakes. Dean played his part perfectly. He was in character, the tipsy, charming Dino. He laughed a little too loudly at Sal's jokes, clapped a friendly hand on the shoulders of stone-faced bodyguards. He made himself harmless, invisible. He was the perfect camouflage. The dinner dragged on, course after rich course, forced toasts. Then, as dessert was cleared, Sal leaned back, patting his lips with a napkin. The room's chatter dimmed. This was the moment. Sammy, Sal began, his voice a gravelly purr. We all admire you, a real performer. He let the word hang, subtly stripping it of dignity. My associate Vinny here, he gestured to a man built like a refrigerator. Vinny says you can do anything. Sing like a bird, dance like, well, you know. A ripple of knowing laughter. Sammy's smile remained a professional fixture, so we got a little wager, a friendly bet. Sal's eyes, dark and empty, locked onto Sammy's. Vinny says you're such a pro, you could make even the most ordinary thing look extraordinary. I said, nah, even Sammy has his limits. He snapped his fingers. A busboy, trembling, was pushed forward, carrying a worn janitor's broom, the bristles splayed and dirty. Sal took it, holding it like a scepter. So, the bet. I say you can't take this humble broom and give us a real show with it. A dancing partner, make it sing. He leaned forward, the gold tooth glinting. Prove me wrong, entertain us. The cruelty was surgical. It wasn't just a racist trope. It was a multi-layered assault. It reduced him to a servant. It mocked his artistry by demanding he create beauty from something meant for dirt. It placed him in a literal no-win situation. To refuse was to insult the mob, to lose the bet and show weakness. To comply was to participate in his own degradation, to become the very caricature his entire life's work fought against. Sammy stood frozen. The vibrant, electric energy that defined him was gone, replaced by a terrible, hollow stillness. He looked at the broom, then at Sal's expectant, malicious face. He glanced at Frank, who was literally shaking with rage, a volcano on the verge of eruption. One wrong move from Frank, and this could turn physically violent, with catastrophic consequences. The room was a prison. The walls were closing in. Sammy's chest felt tight. He took a small, almost imperceptible step forward, his body beginning the terrible, automatic surrender of a performer on command. His spirit was breaking in real time, and everyone saw it. And then from the periphery a sound, not a shout, not a crash, a sigh, a weary, almost bored exhalation. Ah, Saul, all heads swiveled. Dean Martin was pushing himself away from the bar, setting his glass down with a definitive asterisk click asterisk. He shook his head, a slow, sad motion, like a man disappointed by a child's poor manners. He didn't storm, he ambled. He moved into the center of the room with that rolling, relaxed gait, coming to stand beside Sammy, his back partially to the mob boss, as if Saul had suddenly become less interesting than the pattern on the carpet. He put a hand on Sammy's arm, a gentle but firm anchor, stopping his forward motion. A broom, Dean said, not to Saul, but to the room, as if sharing a philosophical observation. You called us over here, interrupted a perfectly good card game Frank was losing, for a bit with a broom. He finally turned those blue eyes on Saul. They held no anger, just a profound, weary disdain. See, Saul, here's what you don't get. That man there, he nodded at Sammy, his voice dropping into an intimate conversational tone that forced everyone to strain to hear. That man is a genius, a once-in-a-lifetime talent. You know what his time is worth out on that stage? A fortune. You know what my time is worth? Slightly more. He allowed the faintest smile. But you're a businessman, right? So let's talk business. You're asking for a custom, private command performance from the two biggest draws in Vegas. Now, I'm not an accountant, but even I know that kind of exclusive engagement, it don't come cheap. He took a step closer to Saul's table, leaning his hands on it, his face now level with the gangsters. His voice was a soft, deadly whisper that carried to every corner of the silent room. So you want the show, you pay for the show, top dollar, contracts, up front, or you go out there like every other tourist, buy a ticket, and watch from the cheap seats with the rest of the paying customers. He paused, letting the unimaginable imagery of this powerful mob boss being equated with a tourist in a cheap seat sink in. But you don't get to demand an encore in your backyard for free. And you especially don't get to demand my friend here debase the very thing that makes him great. That's not business, Saul. That's just poor taste. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. You could hear the ice melt in a distant glass. Saul's face underwent a terrifying transformation. The smugness melted into shock, then congealed into a purple, vein-throbbing rage. His men were statues, their hands hovering near their jackets, eyes darting between their boss and the unflappable man leaning on his table. Dean didn't move. He didn't blink. He held Saul's gaze, his expression one of mild curiosity, as if waiting for an answer to a trivial question. He had done something far more revolutionary than starting a fight. He had reframed the entire relationship. He had spoken the language of commerce to a man used to the language of fear. He had called Sammy his friend in a context that stripped the word of sentiment and made it a statement of alliance, of equal value. He had, with breathtaking audacity, put a price tag on their dignity and presented the bill. Frank saw his moment. He moved to stand just behind Dean and Sammy, a solid wall of Italian-American muscle and fame. The message was clear. This line Dean had drawn, Frank was standing on it, ready to defend it. The standoff lasted a lifetime in seconds. Saul was calculating. He could signal for bloodshed, but to whack Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra in the middle of the Flamingo, the investigation would be relentless. The heat would be unbearable. It was bad for business. Dean, the supposed lightweight, had outmaneuvered him by leveraging their very celebrity as an untouchable shield. Finally, Saul Vittorio let out a bark of laughter, so forced it sounded like a cough. Jesus, Dino, always with the jokes. Can't a guy have a little fun? It was a full, humiliating retreat, disguised as camaraderie. Dean's face relaxed into his familiar, easy smile. He straightened up, patting the table twice as if dusting off his hands. Sure, Saul, fun's fun, but talent's talent. You gotta know the difference. He turned, throwing his arms around both Sammy and Frank. Come on, fellas, I think the air in here just went bad. Let's go find some that ain't been chewed up and spit out. And together, the three of them walked out, not in a hurry, not with a storm of defiance, with the slow, deliberate swagger of men who had just won a war without firing a shot. The door swung shut, leaving behind a room boiling with impotent fury and the stark, embarrassing sight of a dirty broom leaning against an empty chair. Car ride back to the Sands was quiet. Sammy sat in the back, staring out at the neon blur, his body still trembling from the adrenaline crash. He was trying to process the seismic shift that had just occurred. Dean had not just saved him from humiliation, he had redefined the rules of engagement for all of them. Back in Dean's suite, Sammy finally found his voice. "Dean, man, I don't even know what to say. He could have had us clipped. How'd you even think to say that?" Dean was at the sidebar, pouring 3 generous glasses of amber liquid. He didn't answer immediately. He handed a glass to Sammy, another to Frank, and kept one for himself. He took a long sip, looking out at the glittering strip, his reflection serious in the dark glass. The mask was completely off now. The man revealed was weary, sharp, and deeply principled. "Because somebody had to, Pally," he said, his voice low and gravelly without its usual melodic sheen. "Frank would have put one through the ceiling and we'd be digging trenches in the desert right now. Me," he turned, and a shadow of the old smile returned. "I just spoiled their party. They wanted a show. I gave him a business negotiation. They don't know how to handle that. Throws em right off their game." He looked directly at Sammy, his eyes holding a depth of understanding that few ever witnessed. "They can't own what they can't understand, Sam. And they will never, ever understand what you do, so don't let em rent it for the price of a cheap laugh." Frank clapped a hand on Dean's shoulder, a look of pure admiration on his face. "You crazy bastard, you beautiful, crazy bastard." The fallout was not immediate violence, but a chilling, respectful distance. The mob didn't forget, but they now understood the Rat Pack, particularly the enigmatic Dean Martin, was not a simple asset to be controlled. They were a unit, a fortress. The story, of course, never made the papers. It was too dangerous, but it spread through Hollywood and Vegas like wildfire in a whisper. It became legend backstage, in green rooms, in the hushed conversations of other black performers who faced similar, if less dramatic, prejudices. It sent a message: you have allies in high places. The rules can be bent. For Sammy, his devotion to Dean became something sacred, unshakable. It was a debt paid in full every day with loyalty, with love. Years later, when Dean's world was shattered by the tragic death of his son Dean Paul in a military jet crash, it was Sammy who Dean allowed into the innermost circle of his grief. When Dean retreated from the world, a shell of his former self, it was Sammy who could sit with him in silence, understanding that some bonds are forged in fires the public never sees. Dean Martin never, ever spoke of that night publicly. He went back to being Dino, the lovable drunk on his TV show, the hitmaker, the king of cool. The act was perfected, but those in the know saw the subtle changes. In later Rat Pack footage, watch Dean's eyes when they're on Sammy. There's a protective watchfulness, a silent acknowledgement that passes between them. A reminder, I see you, I got you. His legacy, often painted as one of casual talent and luck, is deeply misunderstood. That night at the Flamingo revealed the steel core beneath the silk. It was a masterclass in courage, not the loud, explosive kind, but the quiet, intelligent, devastatingly effective kind. He used his wit as a scalpel and his fame as a shield, not for his own benefit, but to protect a brother. So the story of Dean Martin shutting down the mob boss is more than a great anecdote. It's a key to understanding the hidden architecture of old Hollywood, a world where real power played out in shadowy back rooms, where friendship was the ultimate currency, and where the strongest man in the room wasn't always the one making the most noise. Sometimes, it was the one who could silence a monster with a quiet word and a steady gaze. What other moments of unseen heroism are buried in the archives of Tinseltown? What other giants stood against the darkness when the cameras were off? The file on Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. is closed, but the cabinet is full. This story is just one page. Stick with us. Subscribe, because in the next episode of Hollywood Untold Files *, we delve into a secret so explosive, it rewrites the history of a golden age icon. A secret kept for decades, now revealed for the first time. You won't want to miss what we found.